On December 12, 1963, thousands of people gathered in Nairobi. The long wait was finally over. Kenya was becoming an independent nation. For decades, the country had been ruled by Britain. Now, a new flag was about to rise. As the crowd celebrated, one man stood at the center of history. His name was Jomo Kenyatta. Only a few years earlier, he had been sitting behind prison walls. The British colonial government had accused him of leading a rebellion. They believed imprisoning him would silence his voice forever. But instead, the man they locked away became the man chosen to lead a new nation. How did that happen? Who was Jomo Kenyatta before he became Kenya's first prime minister and later its first president? Was he truly the mastermind behind the Mau Mau uprising? Or had he become a symbol of a freedom movement that was much bigger than one man? To understand his story, we must go back to a time before the prison, before the courtroom, before the celebrations of independence. We must return to a small village called Gatundu, in the green highlands of central Kenya. There, a young boy grew up watching his country change. Foreign rulers were taking control. African families were losing land. Old traditions were being challenged by a new colonial system. The young boy could not know it then. But one day, he would become the face of Kenya's journey to freedom. His life would inspire millions. His decisions would shape a nation. And his legacy would be praised by some, questioned by others, but forgotten by none. Welcome to the African Archive, where we bring Africa's history to life through careful research and powerful storytelling. If you enjoy documentaries that explore the people, kingdoms, and events that shaped Africa, subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the continent's remarkable past. This is the story of Jomo Kenyatta, the prisoner who became a president. Chapter 1. A boy from Gatundu. Long before he became Kenya's first president. Long before he became known around the world. Jomo Kenyatta was a young boy growing up in the village of Gatundu, in the green highlands of central Kenya. He was born around 1897 into the Kikuyu community, the largest ethnic group in Kenya. His birth name was Colonial. Life in Gatundu was simple. Most families depended on farming. They grew crops, raised animals, and lived closely with their neighbors. Children learned by watching their parents and elders. They were taught to respect their traditions, care for their families, and value their community. Young Colonial grew up in this world. But while life in his village followed old customs, Kenya itself was changing. The British colonial government was expanding its control across the country. Large areas of fertile land were taken from African communities and given to European settlers. A settler is someone who moves into another country to live there permanently, often under the protection of a colonial government. Many African families found themselves pushed off land their ancestors had lived on for generations. The changes affected almost every part of life. New taxes were introduced. New laws were enforced. People were expected to work under a system they had never chosen. As Colonial grew older, he began to see these changes for himself. He also had the opportunity to attend a mission school, where he learned to read and write. For many African children at the time, this was a rare opportunity. Education opened a new world. It introduced him to different ideas and different ways of thinking. After leaving school, he worked in several jobs, including as a carpenter, a water department employee, and later as a clerk. Each experience taught him more about the society that colonial rule had created. He saw the differences between how Africans and Europeans were treated. He saw that many of his people had little say in the future of their own country. The more he observed, the more he began to ask difficult questions. Why should Africans lose their land? Why should others make decisions for Kenya? Who would speak for the people whose voices were rarely heard? These questions stayed with him. They would shape the course of his life. Before long, the young man from Gatundu would leave his village behind. He was no longer searching only for a better future for himself. He was beginning to search for a better future for Kenya. Chapter 2. Finding his voice. As the years passed, Jomo Kenyatta became increasingly concerned about what was happening in Kenya. The issue that troubled him most was land. For generations, African families had farmed their ancestral lands. But under British colonial rule, large areas of the most fertile land had been taken and given to European settlers. Many Africans were forced onto smaller pieces of land or made to work on farms they once called their own. To Kenyatta, this was more than an economic problem. It was a question of justice. He believed that the people who lost their land also risked losing their identity. Determined to speak for his people, Kenyatta became involved in African political organizations. He worked with leaders who wanted greater rights and fairer treatment for Africans. His confidence as a speaker grew. So did his reputation. Before long, he was chosen to travel to Britain to present the concerns of Kenyans to the colonial government. For Kenyatta, the journey was life-changing. He met students, writers, and political thinkers from different parts of Africa and the world. Many of them were asking the same question. Why should African countries remain under colonial rule? While living abroad, Kenyatta continued his education. He studied history, politics, and anthropology, the study of human societies, cultures, and traditions. The more he learned, the more determined he became to challenge the false idea that African cultures were backward or uncivilized. In 1938, he published a book called Facing Mount Kenya. The book explained the traditions, beliefs, and way of life of the Kikuyu people. It showed that African societies had their own systems of leadership, justice, and culture long before colonial rule. For many readers, it was the first time they had seen African life described with pride and dignity by an African writer. As his political influence grew, Koma also became known by a new name: Jomo Kenyatta. The name Jomo is commonly understood to mean burning spear in the Kikuyu language, a symbol of strength and determination. The name Kenyatta came from a decorative beaded belt, called a kinyota, that he often wore. Many people assume that the country of Kenya was named after Jomo Kenyatta. But the truth is the opposite. The country already took its name from Mount Kenya, the highest mountain in the country, long before Kenyatta became its first president. It is simply one of history's remarkable coincidences that the man who would one day lead Kenya carried a name so closely linked to the nation itself. Before long, whenever people heard the name Kenyatta, they no longer thought of a beaded belt. They thought of the man who would help lead Kenya to freedom. Years passed before Kenyatta returned home. When he did, Kenya was changing rapidly. Across the country, demands for freedom were growing louder. More Africans wanted a voice in how their country was governed. Kenyatta quickly became one of the leading figures in the independence movement. He traveled widely. He addressed large crowds. He encouraged people to believe that Kenyans could govern themselves. His speeches were calm but powerful. He called for unity rather than division. Hope rather than fear. Freedom rather than submission. But as his influence spread, so did the concern of the colonial government. British officials began to see him not simply as a politician, but as a man capable of changing the future of Kenya. And soon, that fear would change his life forever. Chapter 3. Behind prison walls. By the early 1950s, Kenya was becoming increasingly tense. Many Africans were angry over the loss of their land. They were frustrated by unfair laws and the lack of political rights. Some believed peaceful protests were no longer enough. Out of this growing anger came the Mau Mau uprising. The Mau Mau was a movement made up mostly of members of the Kikuyu community who took up arms against British colonial rule. Its fighters believed that only armed resistance could force Britain to leave Kenya. The British government declared a state of emergency in 1952. A state of emergency is a period when a government gives itself special powers to deal with what it sees as a serious threat. Thousands of people were arrested. Villages were searched. Curfews were imposed. The colonial government was determined to crush the uprising. Jomo Kenyatta was one of those arrested. The British accused him of being the leader of the Mau Mau. Kenyatta denied the accusation. Historians still debate how closely he was connected to the movement. What is certain is that the British government believed removing him from public life would weaken the struggle for independence. He was put on trial in a case that attracted international attention. After months of hearings, he was found guilty and sentenced to prison. Later, after serving his prison sentence, he remained in detention under strict government control. For nearly 9 years, he was kept away from the people who looked to him for leadership. The British believed they had silenced him. But something unexpected happened. The longer Kenyatta remained behind bars, the more he became a symbol. To many Kenyans, he represented the suffering of a people fighting for their freedom. Across Africa and around the world, voices began calling for his release. As other African countries gained independence, pressure on Britain increased. More people began asking whether Kenya should also be free. Inside prison, Kenyatta could do little except wait. He did not know when he would be released. He did not know what Kenya would look like when he walked free again. But history was moving. The winds of change were sweeping across Africa. And before long, the prisoner the British had tried to silence would be called upon to lead an independent nation. Chapter 4. A nation is born. After years of imprisonment and detention, Jomo Kenyatta was finally released in 1961. The Kenya he returned to was not the same country he had left. The fighting had taken a heavy toll. Thousands of lives had been lost. Many families had been separated. Communities carried deep wounds. Yet one thing had become clear. British rule in Kenya was coming to an end. Across Africa, one country after another had gained independence. Kenya was moving in the same direction. Although Kenyatta had spent years behind bars, his influence had only grown. Many Kenyans saw him as the leader who could guide the country into a new future. Political negotiations gathered pace. African leaders and the British government worked towards an agreement on how independence would be achieved. Then, on December 12, 1963, history was made. Kenya became an independent nation. As celebrations filled the streets, the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom, was lowered. In its place, the new Kenyan flag was raised. For millions of Kenyans, it was a moment they had dreamed about for generations. Jomo Kenyatta became Kenya's first prime minister. 1 year later, in 1964, Kenya became a republic. A republic is a country with a president instead of a king or queen as its head of state. Kenyatta became the nation's first president. But he understood that independence did not erase the problems the country faced. Kenya was home to many ethnic communities. Years of colonial rule had created divisions and distrust. The country needed more than freedom. It needed unity. Kenyatta often spoke a single word: Harambee. In Swahili, Harambee means let's pull together. It became a national call for cooperation. People worked together to build schools. They built health centers. They built roads and community projects. Kenyatta believed that if Kenyans worked side by side, they could build a stronger nation than colonial rule had ever allowed. Hope spread across the country. For the first time, Kenyans were shaping their own future. But leading a nation is never easy. The excitement of independence soon gave way to difficult decisions. How should land be shared? How should wealth be distributed? How could one government meet the expectations of millions of people? These questions would become the greatest test of Jomo Kenyatta's presidency. The man who had helped win freedom now had to prove he could build a nation. Chapter 5. The weight of leadership. Becoming independent was a moment of great joy. But Jomo Kenyatta knew that celebrations would not solve Kenya's problems. The new nation had to build its economy. It had to create jobs. It had to improve education and healthcare. And perhaps the hardest challenge of all, it had to heal the wounds left by colonial rule. One of the biggest issues was land. For many years, African families had watched large areas of fertile land taken by European settlers. After independence, many expected that this land would quickly be returned. Some land was bought back and redistributed. But not everyone benefited equally. Many Kenyans felt that the changes were too slow. Others believed that powerful people received more than ordinary citizens. The question of land remained one of the country's most sensitive issues. Even today, it continues to shape discussions about Kenya's history. Despite these challenges, Kenya made important progress during Kenyatta's presidency. New schools were built. Roads connected more communities. Hospitals and health centers expanded. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, while businesses and industries continued to grow. Kenya became one of East Africa's strongest economies. Many people believed the country had a bright future. But success also brought criticism. As the years passed, some opposition leaders argued that too much power was becoming concentrated in the hands of the government. Others accused senior officials of corruption and favoritism. Corruption means using public office for personal gain instead of serving the people. There were also concerns that political opponents were being treated unfairly. These criticisms became stronger after the assassination of Tom Mboya in 1969. Mboya was one of Kenya's most prominent young leaders. His death shocked the nation and raised difficult questions about Kenya's political future. Although no evidence linked Kenyatta personally to the killing, the event deepened political tensions and remains one of the most debated moments in Kenya's history. Through all of this, Kenyatta continued to call for Harambee. He reminded Kenyans that their greatest strength was working together. He believed that division would only weaken the young nation. For some, he was the father of the nation. For others, his presidency left important questions unanswered. By the late 1970s, Jomo Kenyatta had become one of Africa's longest-serving leaders. His health was beginning to fail. The man who had guided Kenya from colonial rule to independence was approaching the end of his journey. But the story of his leadership was far from over. Chapter 6. The Father of a Nation. On August 22, 1978, Jomo Kenyatta died while serving as President of Kenya. He was around 80 years old. News of his death spread quickly across the country. For many Kenyans, it felt like the end of an era. The man who had stood at the center of Kenya's journey to independence was gone. Across the nation, people gathered to mourn. Some remembered him as the prisoner who refused to give up. Others remembered him as the leader who guided Kenya through its first years as an independent country. The government declared a period of national mourning. Leaders from around the world paid tribute to the man many called the father of the Kenyan nation. According to Kenya's constitution, Daniel Arap Moi, who had been the vice president, became the country's new leader. The transfer of power was peaceful. Kenya had lost its founding president. But the nation he helped build continued. Today, Jomo Kenyatta's legacy is still discussed. Many people praise him for leading Kenya to independence and helping keep the country united during its early years. They point to the growth of education, agriculture, business, and national institutions under his leadership. They remember his call for Harambee, let's pull together, as a message that encouraged Kenyans to work side by side to improve their communities. Others believe his presidency left difficult problems behind. They question how land was shared after independence. They point to growing inequality and the concentration of political power. These debates continue among historians and Kenyans today. And perhaps that is what makes history so important. It reminds us that great leaders can achieve remarkable things while still making decisions that future generations continue to examine. There is no doubt that Jomo Kenyatta changed the course of Kenya's history. He helped lead his country out of colonial rule. He stood at the birth of an independent nation. And he carried the enormous responsibility of guiding that nation through its earliest years. Whether people celebrate his achievements, question some of his decisions, or do both, his place in African history is secure. Thank you for joining us on the African Archive as we explore the life of Jomo Kenyatta. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to the African Archive and turn on notifications. Together, we'll continue uncovering the remarkable people, kingdoms, and events that shaped Africa and helped shape the world. Some leaders are remembered for the battles they fought. Others for the speeches they gave. Jomo Kenyatta is remembered because he stood at one of the most important moments in his country's history. When Kenya stopped being a colony and became a nation.